You're listening to Let's Get Surety. Let me hear your bonding talk with Kat Shamapande.
Hey everyone, it's Kat Shamapande. Thanks so much for joining us for this episode of Let's Get Surety. I've got with me today my co-host, Mark McCallum, CEO of NASBP. Hey Mark, thanks for being on.
Hey Kat, great to be back. Always enjoy it.
Well, we've got a big topic today. We're going to be talking about some economic pressure points and how they're affecting the construction industry and then surety as well.
Can't be more timely than that.
I know.
Sure.
Well, to do that with us today, we have Eric Gauss, the chief economist at Dodge Construction Network. Hey, Eric, thanks for being on.
Hi there, Kat. Nice to be here with you.
We also have Sarah Martin. She's the associate director of forecasting at Dodge Construction Network. Thanks for being on, Sarah.
Thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
Well, before we dive into talking about the economy, Eric, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and about Dodge?
Sure. Dodge Construction Network has been around for a long time, over a century. It tracks all the construction projects within the United States, everything from residential all the way to streets and bridges and everything in between. We track those projects for our clients and for the construction industry as a whole. We supply the census with a lot of the data that they use to make their estimates for what's happening to construction spending and put that sort of data. My background, I've been the chief economist here for about a year. Prior to that, I worked at Moody's Corporation in the economics unit there. And prior to that, I worked in academia for several years after I got my PhD and did, the sort of academic route for a while. I've been a macroeconomist this whole time. So that's sort of my angle on everything. So I really, in coming to Dodge, I'm using this lens of what's going on in the macroeconomy and how that's going to influence the sector.
That's great. Sarah, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, sure. I'd love to. Yeah, so I've been at Dodge for about six and a half years now. I've been forecasting economic markets for closer to 10. And yeah, I think, I'm on the economics team at Dodge. So we just spend our days analyzing the construction industry and really thinking about the outlook and the forecast. So that's really kind of my area of focus and bread and butter.
That's great. Well, Sarah, I know you shared a blog post with us that we posted on NASBP blogs that was related to mega projects. What are those forecasting numbers telling you about mega projects in the construction industry?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, so our team did a sort of big analysis on mega projects in the midpoint of last year. Obviously, these mega projects they've been, making the headlines, very influential in recent years, especially post-pandemic. I would say the key kind of takeaways from that analysis, one is kind of the influence on just like project costs. So one of the ways we did the analysis was, a lot of people think about mega projects and sort of a static cutoff in their mind, right? Oh, maybe it's $100 million and over, or 500 million or something like that. But the issue is, with inflation, that the $100 million project 5 years ago, that same project is going to be much more right now. So we sort of did a percentile analysis instead and kind of tried to make sure that we're tracking the same cohort of projects over sort of this 10-year period of time. What we found is that most of those mega projects were taking place in manufacturing, no surprise there, and data centers as well. That accounted for roughly 2/3 of that activity. But interestingly enough, we've been seeing kind of mega projects be a little bit on the decline and more kind of opportunity for those medium and large size projects. And so that's certainly been an interesting trend that we're kind of keeping an eye on.
And you mentioned data centers. We hear a lot about that and the fact that they're kind of taxing a lot of resources by contractors and other parties there. You mentioned manufacturing. What about just general infrastructure projects, in the transportation realm? Is that all part of what you're looking at and part of the numbers you were just talking about?
Yeah, I think transportation is still, I would say we have manufacturing, data centers. In third place is transportation projects. And in fourth place are healthcare projects. And that's really, most of where mega project activity has been centered in recent years.
And do you see those four remaining at the forefront of that kind of activity well into this year, next year, and beyond?
Yeah, I would certainly say so. Data centers, of course, are this rapidly growing cohort.
Yep.
So we're seeing, hyperscalers, those are the projects that make the headlines. And we see a lot of those projects still coming into our project pipeline, in the planning queue. So that certainly will be an area of growth. But again, a lot of momentum building for medium and large scale data centers as well, right? As that sector continues to diversify and mature a bit, we're going to need more, decentralized, kind of closer to the end user data centers as well. And I think beyond that, of course, transportation and healthcare have been two areas where we've continued to see, sustained growth in mega projects.
Could you maybe talk a little bit about the impact that's having on workforce and how that might play out and how you're looking at the numbers?
Yeah, that's a great question. Actually, Eric, I feel like you have usually some really interesting tidbits when you talk to this. Yeah.
Yeah. So one of the things that you'll notice with these mega projects, and they're very idiosyncratic in how they influence construction, meaning where they are located is more important than the fact that they exist, right? So Texas doesn't have a lot of electricians running around because they're all in the hyperscaler world, right? Because you just need a ton of electricians relative to the size of the project even, right? You just need a lot of them. And so they suck up that resource, which slows down pretty much every other construction project because every building needs electricity.
Right.
So if you can't get an electrician, you have to slow down your project somewhere along the way because you have to put the wires in and get it inspected before you can move on to the next step, right? So again, it kind of depends on what type of building you're talking about in terms of mega project and where exactly they are, determining how they influence the other projects in the region.
So with that kind of limitation on available electrical specialty contractors, what does that mean for other sectors of the construction industry? And what does that mean for pricing of those projects as well?
Yeah, again, and particularly if you take something like data centers where they're spending money quite freely, right? It just makes it really hard to compete on that particular subcontractor space, right? And so the prices are naturally going up. It also means that there are people who are moving to take advantage of that, right? Like now's a good time to move as an electrician to Texas or Virginia. But those are the kinds of things that are happening. And yes, the prices are going up for that particular specialty. And certainly anything having to do with the data center build out is going to be affected. And yeah, the costs are going up and they're going up across the board. I mean, everywhere prices are going up.
Right. And I mentioned timing is also critical now that people who wish to undertake projects really need to think about the timing of those projects being started and completed. Yeah, you see that in the planning process currently.
Yeah, we've seen a couple of things happening in the planning process, mostly just a slowing down throughout 2025, sort of every month, basically from April to September, the timelines for like we would look at projects when they first start and then say, hey, when was the first time that we saw this go into planning? And we could look at that, how many months it would take to get projects through. And that kept on getting longer and longer and longer. And anecdotally, we don't have that data as cleanly, on the construction phase. But anecdotally, when we talk to our clients and to GCs and subs, they all say the same thing. It's like, it's really like all of these things are going a lot slower than we had hoped. So yeah, it's sort of across the board. We're seeing those issues.
It seems like there's so many other factors at play right now in the economy and, mega projects being one. But, I hear a lot of people use that word volatility and for a lot of different reasons. Some of it, I think, really kind of being produced in the political arena in terms of, you see that fight amongst the Fed and the administration. Eric, would you like to comment on what we're seeing now in that arena and how it may impact people in their planning and how they look at the economy in the immediate future?
Sure. Yeah, the Fed is a really important institution that has come under fire from the current administration. pretty strongly for that matter. There's a case that's in front of the Supreme Court for Lisa Cook's position. And there's also an investigation into Chair Powell, who is meant to step down in June as the chairperson. That presents a lot of very interesting things. So in June will be very, very critical. It's the end of the Supreme Court cycle. So we will get a decision by then on the Lisa Cook case. We also will find out more about what's going on with Chair Powell. And that's really important because in history, what we have seen is when the Federal Reserve lacks independence, meaning it does the bidding of the people who create the debt, it sets up a very bad dynamic within the economy where you tend to then inflate away that debt. And so what we're worried about is a situation in the 1970s where Richard Nixon had a lot of influence on the Fed chair, had him keep rates low, and that led to a lot of inflation during a time when we also had a stagnant economy. And so that led to the era of stagflation. We're not there yet, but we're in that precarious situation where inflation is already above the Federal Reserve's mandate. And we see a lot of weakness in the job market. So could we slide into this stagflationary environment? It seems pretty likely. We're not there yet, but that is what the concern is and why there are so many economists, particularly people on the Fed as well, that are very concerned about the possibility of the lack of Federal Reserve independence.
And you touched, I think, very briefly about job creation and that the role of that, in view of inflation. Maybe talk a little bit more about that, why that's a concerning indicator and why there's a need for that independence of the Fed.
It's a concern and confusing is really part of it as well. So we've seen job growth slow from 2023 all the way through into 2026. This is by design, right? The Federal Reserve has had interest rates high because of inflation to try and cool off the economy. That was the point. What has been really fascinating is that, and contrary to what economists kind of expected, is the unemployment rate has remained fascinatingly low. The main reason for that is at the same time, there was another policy that has started to pull a lot of the labor force out of the labor market, which means you've got the denominator going down at the same time that the numerator is going down. So it just sort of happens to go down together. That has been very fascinating and interesting. So there doesn't seem to be the stress that we would expect, given that we have literally for a year basically had no job growth. The other indicator that makes us worry a little bit is that if you look at the revisions to the BLS jobs data, the companies that report on the number of people that are working for them on their payrolls, they get 3 months to do that. And we get revisions based off of the first month. We just sort of say, hey, we've got 60, 70%. Great. Here's the number as of now. And then we revise it as we go forward. We've seen that number be negative, those revisions be negative for a lot of the months in the last little while. Now, the thing that's interesting from an economist's perspective is that when you ask a survey like that, the people who tend to delay are the companies that are in trouble, and they're more likely to have bad responses in times of trouble, right? Meaning negative responses. So when you see lots of negatives, you then say, oh, there are a lot of companies that are struggling because they're reducing their payrolls, and we have jobs that we're not adding any jobs. Man, should be bad. But if you look at the aggregate unemployment numbers, it doesn't look so bad. So it's very confusing, but that's why economists are very nervous about this particular moment in time.
One kind of adding to that nervousness, I imagine, is another recent factor, and you hear it being talked a lot about in terms of possible effect on inflation, and that is what's happening with Iran and the effects of that on the oil supply. Eric, would you like to maybe kind of touch on that as well as something that is adding to, I'll call it the V word, volatility, and what may
Yeah,
go forward.
don't mention that U word either, uncertainty, right? That is also the one that nobody's allowed to say anymore. Yeah, so, the situation in Iran is one where we have very little clarity on what is going to happen in the future, other than the longer that the Strait of Hormuz stays shut and oil isn't flowing through there, the higher oil prices are going to go. And the longer it's actually going to take for us to unwind the situation to get the oil flowing again. Because once the oil rigs are sort of shut down, it takes a lot of work to get them going again. So that's really what the concern is. As those oil prices remain high, right, that's slowly going to filter through the economy. And in fact, yes, gas prices have gone up. More importantly, for the construction industry, diesel prices are going up. If you look at it in a relative sense, the diesel prices are going up way faster than gasoline prices. And that's obviously a grave concern for the construction costs. But that being said, it's going to keep going up, right? As long as those barrels aren't flowing, the more those prices are going to go up. And eventually that's going to filter through to the economy. We are just starting to see a lot of the hit of the tariffs start to flow through. We saw that in the recent PPI report, and we've seen that now for the last 2 or 3 of those, where producer prices are clearly starting to be elevated, indicating that the tariffs are really starting to flow through. So we've got that wave coming, and then this oil price is going to flow through to a lot of other products that, escaped tariffs. A lot of our homegrown food, for example, right? That all requires gasoline to drive around. Those prices are going to go up in the grocery store, right? So now we've got sort of a bigger problem beyond just what's happening with construction. So yeah, that's the other thing that I think in this context makes, if I can circle back to the comments about the Federal Reserve, right? Makes us really nervous about this moment, and where we really need to have a strong Fed to be able to make it through this particular point in time.
Right. They need clarity and not pressure, I would imagine.
They need the free rein. Yeah, they need the free rein to do what they need to do in order to manage inflation and the broader economy. Yeah, that's exactly right.
With all these factors at play, I'm curious, Sarah, how do you think this portends for some of those mega projects, such as the data centers? Those hyperscalers, do they have so much money that this really doesn't impact their plans and they need to get them online? Or do you see that them being impacted by, for example, inflation, cost of diesel, and all the rest? May not be direct, but indirect. Are those things kind of that you've taken into account in looking at your forecast in the near future?
Yeah, I tend to think of, the mega projects being a little bit more insulated and resilient. Obviously, it's a bit of a case by case basis, but obviously if they're owned by these multinational corporations that have a ton of extra funds, they can kind of weather the storm a little bit more when it comes to higher costs and labor shortages, I guess, to an extent. They can be a little bit more competitive in that space. But, I still think that doesn't mean they are completely insulated from that. And there are risks to all these projects. We know on data centers in particular, we often talk about, more of the local pushback to these projects is becoming an increasing issue. And then we, of course, know that water and power are kind of a constraint there as well. And so thinking about them by project size, I think that there could be a little bit more upside potential, again, for those medium and large size projects who, maybe require a little bit less labor and are able to kind of get through that process a bit more quickly. But of course, all of those projects are still very much affected by all of these increased risks right now.
Well, and you kind of talked about how it's affecting construction and mega projects. Are there some sectors of the construction industry that are more insulated from kind of the political unrest and the changes in oil and gas prices than others?
Unfortunately, something like oil and gas, it hits everybody, right? Yeah. There are some that rely more heavily on it, like infrastructure, right? Because it's done mostly with large machines, right? So, okay, that's probably going to get hit a little bit harder than, your residential construction, but still, in the end, everybody's getting hit by it. And the bigger problem with volatility and uncertainty is the cost of doing business. And I mean that quite literally in terms of interest rates, right? Risk premium are higher. You have larger gaps between mortgage rates and the 10-year treasury, for example. That's also true of all commercial lending rates. That matters. And that's a literal cost of doing business. But then there's also just the cost of doing business in terms of under uncertainty, people pause, they take their time, right? They can't just make quick decisions. And so the timelines are getting longer. And as we all know, time is money, right? So it just makes that process take longer. Your loans have to last longer, right? All the rents that you're paying for the equipment lasts longer. So the cost of doing business is going up outside of literally, here's how much we're paying for oil or for lumber or whatever. There are other components of that cost that are increasing because of volatility.
Right.
I would just say one of the, in terms of maybe some sectors that are have a slightly more positive outlook, it would be healthcare, right? In terms of just the sheer demand we have for healthcare services right now in the United States, thanks to those demographic pressures. And, last year, although we created almost no jobs in the US economy, most of those job gains were centered in the healthcare sector. And that kind of continues to be a place where we're seeing a little bit of momentum.
Well, so we've talked a lot about different factors at play, a lot of, I think, really significant influences, but we haven't used, I'll call it the big R word, recession. Are there certain things that you see that could be the tipping point or tipping points where we might go there this year? Is that something, Eric, you see?
Yeah. So, I mean, like any good economist, I have a recession probability model in my back pocket that I like to pull out and show everybody and say, look at me. Yeah. So I do that pretty regularly in my presentations and talk about that. What's interesting about that is if you use sort of the standard metrics, meaning, housing starts, unemployment rate, the slope of the yield curve, the difference between the 10-year and the 1 year, for example. All of those kinds of fun economic statistics that I talk to any economist to be like, oh yeah, I got that in my model too. Are the recession risks elevated? Yeah, a little bit. Not terribly so, because in aggregate, things look okay. There's certainly signs of weakness left and right if you really sort of scrape the surface. It's clear that the strength that is there is coming from a few specific areas. Like Sarah said, in the jobs arena, it's healthcare. If you look at consumption, it's really the top 20% of consumers that are wealthy consumers that are doing all the spending and having that growth happen. If you look at the stock market, that's just those tech companies that are AI driven. So there's a little bit of weakness there if you scratch through the surface, even on that aggregate data. But again, it looks okay. It looks weak, but okay. One of the things that I've done is I've added a policy uncertainty index to that same model. And the minute you do that, you get a huge gap. You double the probability of recession from, let's say, 30% to about 60%. Okay. So my contention is that if we do slide into recession, that's going to come because of uncertainty. Basically, people are sitting on their hands. And what we're really waiting for is for the wheels to come off. Right? When do enough of the distribution of firms and consumers run through their safety net of cash,
right,
and stop being active? When do they pull back and really pull back? That's the point where we'll tip. And I got to be honest with you, I don't know where that is. Like, I don't know when you hit that tipping point. The more days we go on, the more and more likely that is. But it could be 3 months, could be 6 months.
Right. I saw an article recently, I guess, talking about people withdrawing from their 401ks at a more pronounced rate recently. And I wonder if that goes to what you were saying, Eric, about that uncertainty and people, not sure and wanting to take care of things now. But,
sure.
Very interesting dynamic going on. So it sounds like from what you said, Sarah, and what you said, Eric, if I am a construction company now, I really just need to be very strategic in how I'm looking at opportunities and what I should pursue. Would you agree with that, Sarah?
Yeah, I like, as Eric did a great job of summarizing it, I do think that there's a lot of weakness right now, but there are still areas of opportunity, from a construction standpoint. Those top consumers that are still spending means that we're going to see more spending or more construction of those luxury kind of retail stores, right? Those brands, or, luxury hotels and that kind of thing. So digging into, like, again, the different dimensions of different sectors will give you those kind of strategic areas of opportunity in the interim, of course, with the asterisk that there's things like costs and labor that are extremely difficult to overcome for any of these sectors, and will certainly be a factor going forward in 2026.
Well, Sarah and Eric, it has been great having you on with us and kind of talking through what's happening in the economy now and those pressure points that are affecting the construction industry and the surety industry as well. Hopefully we'll get you back on again with us sometime to share some more news about what you're seeing in the data that you guys collect at Dodge.
We'd be happy to. Thanks for having us.
Thanks so much.
You've been listening to Let's Get Surety, brought to you by the National Association of Surety Bond Producers. For more information about the NASBP and its members, visit nasbp.org.